Just real quickly, I just want to say that Dr. Stephen and Chrissy and I and Gray, we met last summer, and he was kind enough to kind of almost do a private little talk like he's getting ready to do now. And I have to say that it had a profound effect on me, more so than almost anything I can think of. And literally the next day when I went out to look at my horses, it was like I was looking at a different animal. So I hope that as we go throughout the weekend, that it can have an effect on you as well in a positive way, so that we can all move in a positive and productive way to spend time with these guys. So without any further ado, Dr. Steve Peters.
That's what I hope to give you is a user's manual on how horses' brains work. Now, why would you want to listen to me? Well, brains are about all I've done for a long, long time. Human brains for almost 3 decades. So every day I'm looking at neuroimaging and scans and assessing patients. So what does that have to do with horses? I have a passion for horses, and I think that, I want you to see I can sit on a horse without falling off. So I think that adds some legitimacy to the scientist, because sometimes scientists really shoot themselves in the foot. They do research and you wonder, have you ever seen a horse or ridden a horse? How relevant is that to me? So hopefully these things will be relevant to you. It was a frustrating search for me. Because I knew about evidence-based medicine. And in evidence-based medicine, you can't do something unless you can prove it works. Or an insurance company is not going to pay you. So you have to follow a protocol that's been proven to get a certain result. So I would ask in the horse world, well, how about this? And I'd ask 5 experts, and I'd get 5 different answers. Some diametrically opposed with each other. And some just made absolutely no sense. So I said, well, I understand brains. I'm just going to focus on the horse's brain. How does it work? What are the connections? What's the chemistry behind this? But I think I owned 4 or 5 horses at the time. So if you're a scientist, a sample of 5, even though you'll see studies, these 4 horses all kept in the same stable, all eating the same food. You can't generalize that out to the rest of the world. So I needed to find a large sample. I needed to find somebody who had seen lots of horses. So I found this guy, Martin Black. Martin comes from 5 generations of ranchers. They were in Idaho before Idaho was a state. They fought off Indians to hold on to their property. Through wars, right up to World War II, they supplied horses to the military. And so Martin just grew up in that whole atmosphere. Martin's father-in-law was Ray Hunt. I don't know if you know who that is. Many people do in the horse world, that movement toward a friendlier way of doing things. Martin ran a big ranch, the Wine Cup Ranch, which is millions of acres and I don't know how many thousands head of cattle. And Tom Dorrance used to come up there, and I don't know if you know who Tom Dorrance is, but this is what got Martin and I talking. Is I'd say something to him and he'd say, how do you know that? And I said, well, I know that because I know brains. So neurologically, this is how it works. And he'd say, you know what? No one's ever told me that except for Tom. So I didn't get it from hands-on. I got it from understanding the brain. So when Martin and I really started to talk to one another and dissect out lots of brains and discuss things, it was just one thing after another until we kind of built this whole thing. That was why it was exciting to meet Mark, because his philosophies rang true with how horses work neurologically. In fact, I read that passage in his book and I said, he is so right on. I got to write this guy an email, and that kind of started our collaboration. This is a human brain. I hope you don't mind, I'm going to have to walk over here on occasion, so
Okay.
won't end up in your lap, hopefully. This big yellow piece is the frontal lobe. I was so disappointed when I first started studying medicine because the first brain surgery I saw, I said, uh-oh, it's not color-coded, I'm in trouble. So it's not really yellow. But you can appreciate how large this is. What do we do there? Well, we strategize, we organize, we plan for the future. All those sorts of things happen in the frontal lobe. This is a horse brain. There is no frontal lobe. There's some, what we call prefrontal lobe or rudimentary frontal lobe. There's some, but not a big mass, what we call a neocortex in our brain. It's fascinating for what it is. It does things that our brains really can't. But let's understand how it works and not necessarily think that our brains are a good analogy to use. Human brain on the left, horse brain on the right. Actually, see this big flap right here? I'll come over here and right here. That's the olfactory bulbs. That's related to smell. So you can see how important that is to a horse. And as we go through things, our general rule is you can tell how important something is in the brain by either how large it is or if it's strategically located. So that'll help us find the important points. And these things will be rolling off your tongue by Sunday. I promise. Ours you can hardly see. They're embedded. They almost look like a shoestring compared to the horse's big. Okay, here's a human brain. Motor cortex, sensory cortex. The motor cortex in our brain and in the horses, the right side of the brain moves the left side of the body. The left side of the brain moves the right side of the body. There's no Mr. Lefty, Mr. Righty, two brains that are working opposite of one another. It's well integrated. And I'll prove that to you. So that's one myth we can just throw right out the window because it gets in the way. Now, if I wanted to make a horse brain, I would take a scalpel and I would just cut, leaving a little bit of frontal lobe here, and take this away. And what I would be left with is a motor sensory creature. That's what our horse is. It's a motor sensory creature. I got stuck there. So it would look like this. No big frontal lobe. This is a horse brain. This is that big olfactory bulb. See these little things that look like whiskers here? They're like little feelers, and they're embedded in the skull, an area called a cribriform plate. And so they pick up sensations. So smell is the only sense that goes directly to the brain. Everything else has to go here to an area called the thalamus. It's like Grand Central Station. It gets to the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it where it needs to go. You'll see a zillion pictures and slides of the thalamus, so you don't have to necessarily write it down, but you can if you want to. But this will get more and more familiar as we move along. And this is sometimes why humans, when they have a head injury, will lose their sense of smell. Because the trauma, the force, not only will bump those olfactory bulbs, but it'll shear off all these little feelers here. And so lots of times somebody who's banged the front of their head or a rebound against the skull will lose their sense of smell. That's a horse. That's a dog. That's an ox. Here's the horse. See this little bit of gray area right there? That's in their frontal lobe. What is that? Well, it happens to be motor cortex. That's not so for us, but for the horse. What frontal lobe they have is used motorically. It does two things. The horse's frontal lobe helps it in voluntary motor movement. So when the horse decides, I'm going to go along with this movement, the frontal lobe is like a spark plug. Okay, let's go. when you're pulling your horse by the lead line, and I'm not going, right? So you don't have their frontal lobe there helping you out for voluntary motor movement, but you just step aside and kind of pull them off balance a little bit, and then they move in that direction. You've kind of overridden that system, because the motor system will then take over. And attention. Attention. The frontal lobe plays a big role in attention, and it's one of the last places to develop in a horse. So the 3-year-old, the 2-year-old that we put in futurities, etc., they don't have an attention span. You know, it's like taking a 3rd grader and putting them in a college class. You know, they can't stay focused that long. Their brains are not ready to do that. So we want, with younger horses, to just give them doses, and small doses with breaks, and not really overload them, because they don't have the capacity to attend to you throughout. They're not old enough to do that. You know, it's competitions and things that have determined that, you know, we're not going to wait for all those physical plates to get in place. We're not going to wait for the brain to get old enough. We're going to have these contests now. And futurities, those horses at the very top, they're freaks. I mean that. Only very few can tolerate the stress we put them through to do those kinds of things. That's why those old-time vaqueros and waddies out in Texas, I asked Martin, before any of this stuff happened, when did you start horses? He said, my granddad would not let us touch a horse till it was 4. Where we get in trouble, big trouble, is when we think a horse has a human brain. And you know, you might say, well, what's the harm in these things like, well, my horse is a right brain introverted Sagittarius. That's why they do what they do. And I have a chart to prove it. Paid quite a lot for it as well. It's not accurate. It's not scientific. And worst of all, it's not in the best interest of your horse. Horse is being a horse. All those labels we put on are because we have a big frontal lobe, so we can think up all kinds of things. And one of the worst, and one of the things I talked to Mark about that really bothers me, and it's rampant in the horse world, this idea of respect and disrespect. Respect is an abstract concept. You need a frontal lobe to understand that concept. So, if your horse is walking into your space, you've either done something, trained that horse to walk into your space, or sending some kind of message to your horse that it's okay to do that. But you have to take onus for why that's happening. But if we label it disrespect, what do we get? Then we get justification for punishment. That's the bad part. The horse is getting punished for just trying to figure things out. And it's us who have made the message so confusing. So instead of understanding, we're developing confusion. Instead of support, we're relying on punishment. That's really not fair to the horse. That's not the way they're designed. Evidence. This is the hierarchy of evidence. So what I want you to know is the very bottom rung. The evidence that's toughest to legitimize is expert opinion. So a charismatic person who says, follow my program, it's A, B, C, and D. Some things may work, but that's opinion. Case reports are when we sort of follow a horse and we write up everything that happens and everything that we did, and that would give us some information. So that holds a little more legitimacy. Cohort is groups. Randomized control groups are when we would say, okay, I got 10 horses, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. Okay, all the A's are going over here, all the B's are going over here. I don't want to set up my research where I got all these ringers over here, all the good ones that are going to prove my point, and all the bad ones over here. What I want to do is randomize my study, and the best of all that you can hope for, and we'll look at some of these studies, are systematic reviews. That's where, for example, cribbing. What you do in a systematic review is you look at every published peer-reviewed scientific study on cribbing, right? And you'll start looking up studies, and pretty soon they'll list the studies they used to do their studies. And then you look for the general trend across a systematic review. That's looking at these kinds of horses and these kinds of horses and these kinds of horses, all under the same conditions, all looking at the same subject matter. So that carries a lot of weight. It's another reason I hooked up with Martin, is that he's worked with race horses, Mustangs, $1 million show horses, draft horses, and he would tell you, I don't treat any of them any differently. They all have brains. Sure, some have, are more excitable, some are more docile, but the underlying principles still ring true. Behaviorism was more popular in Europe, actually, than the United States. And some of the things in the United States started with a person, B.F. Skinner. And so there was operant conditioning. You would get a pigeon to peck a certain amount of times, and then they get a reward, so positive and negative reinforcement and things like that. But one of the big premises was the brain is a black box. We can't tell what's in your brain. That was the behaviorist tenet. So what we'll do, we'll measure the input. So everything we do to that animal we'll measure, and then we'll measure the outcome. So I've heard of things like rainometers. So what we'll do, we'll get some reins, and we'll put measures on there. We'll have an expert ride their horse, and we'll see how much pressure they're putting on the reins, and then we'll know, and then everybody can ride with that same amount of pressure. Well, animals are different, the weather's different, there's so many variables there, but if you measure those things, you can really get lost. But here's the interesting part, is that we can look in that black box. We can look in that black box. This is a horse getting an MRI. This is a horse getting a CT scan. This is a horse with an EEG setup. So what we're doing is looking at the brain waves in the horse. So we just sort of map out the areas we want to measure and strap the device on. There's little electrodes, and they fit like cups. We're not sticking it into their brain. And there are pens that are hooked to those electrodes that can show brain activity. So we can look at brain activity, and we can look at structure. We can look at metabolism, all kinds of things going on now. So the horse is really going to benefit from this, because we're going to have accurate readings. That's no longer a black box. Here's the horse's brain. No big frontal lobe. Let's take a look at a few things. So the spinal cord would be coming up here. This big structure here is called the cerebellum. That's Latin for small brain, miniature brain. It almost looks like one. It's pretty large. The pituitary gland under the hypothalamus. This is going to be important to us when we understand stress and cortisol in the brain. The hypothalamus will make a chemical, will send to the pituitary gland, which will send down to the adrenal glands, that will make adrenaline, and the granddaddy of all stress hormones, cortisol. Optic chiasm, we'll get a real good picture of this. Chiasm means cross, and that's what happens is, here are the eyes on the side of the head. The optic nerves come together and cross in a big X, and then the fibers go to the back. So, what the horse sees in the left side of its brain registers in the right side of its left eye, right brain, right eye, left brain. That crosses. And in fact, it's interesting. More information, for some reason, gets transmitted to the other side of the opposite side of the brain and stays on the same side of the brain. So absolutely, it's a well-connected system. Just because their eye is on one side of their head doesn't mean it doesn't end up getting to the whole brain. Some people think the connection is that way to allow more connections to the motor strip, so that if you have a threat right there, boom, you're in action in the opposite direction. And some of that chemistry is what you feel when, because people say, well, I introduce the saddle pad to my horse on one side, and then it's so dumb, I have to go back over to the right side and introduce it. That's a built-in reaction. You know, that's a perfect design. We don't want them doing a lot of thinking because that takes too many calories and too much space, right? So their design is to fight or flight and freeze. That's another one that we'll talk about. One structure I want to point out is this band here. That's called a corpus callosum. Its only job is to allow information from the right side of the brain to go to the left and vice versa. And it crosses over that corpus callosum, and it's very thick. So, and it makes sense to you if you stop to think about it. Well, if the left side of the brain works the right side of the body, it's got to get to the other side, right? So it's not a Mr. Lefty, Mr. Righty type of situation. They're a whole brain creature. Here, I've dissected out the cerebellum. Here's the spinal cord right here, and the cerebellum, just to give you a sense of how large that structure is. So if it's so big, it must be important. What does it do? Timing, balance, coordination, fine motor movement. So, and it hones as well. So as the horse is learning a pattern of things, that cerebellum is saying, well, a little faster, a little slower, etc., to develop that motor pattern. So it's an important structure. I'll try to cut this. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to get a slice of an area called the substantia nigra. That's Latin for a black substance. And it's hard to appreciate here, but there's a little bit of black substance that you can see here. And that's a meeting place between the spinal cord and the brain. That black substance is dopamine. It's actually such a rich river of dopamine that you can see it with the naked eye. So if I get a good cut, we'll see that. If I dissect out a human brain and the patient has Parkinson's disease, I won't see much dopamine at all, because Parkinson's is a disease of diminished dopamine. And you can see it plays a role in movement. Dopamine in learning, reward, and movement. And some scientists think that's why they're connected, because you move to get your reward. Right? And that's why Parkinson's patients shuffle and their motor coordination is off. They have a tremor, a rest tremor, because of dopamine depletion. This will give you some perspective of the size of the brain. Spinal cord. There's the brain, and there's that big cerebellum back there. This is also interesting for a couple of reasons. Some people will look at a spade bit, and I'm not saying use them or don't use them. You know, it depends on how well the person rides and how sensitive they are, or what their belief is about the horse even having a bit in its mouth. But when you look at it, you start to think of your own mouth. Look at that big thing. But look how long that tongue is. So that spade bit just kind of sets back there. The real problem is when people pull on that and it rips up into the upper palate. That's a problem. But when you look at gear that we use with horses, try to think of the horse's anatomy, and that'll help you to see how well, because sometimes snaffle bits can be just as rough as a spade bit. You know, if it's breaking in the middle and you're tearing on the corner of your horse's mouth, that can be just as painful in the wrong hands. This is a real thin slice. So it's another chance for you to see where the brain is located. So you know on between your horse's ears, when you rub up there, you kind of got that little lump. That's right up there. Down below that, about as you hit the ears, that's where the brain starts, that brain case. Not a lot of room. And here are the eyes. So if somebody says, well, I'm going to euthanize my horse, I'm going to shoot him right between the eyes. That'd be a bad place. If you want to find where it is, put your horse's head down and just draw an X from the ears to the eyes, and that's about right where the brain will sit. The autonomic nervous system. This is information we'll use a lot because Jim and Mark and a lot of people are concerned with the autonomic nervous system because what we want to do, we want to help the horse regulate the autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. Sympathetic, fight or flight. And homeostasis is a nice balance. And that's where your horses like to be, in parasympathetic system and balance. And if they pick up something with their motor sensory, so they pick up something in their senses that detects a threat, they're out of homeostasis. They start to go up into the sympathetic nervous system, and then the thalamus has to send a message to the motor system, we got to do something, we have to move. So your horse spooks, right? And runs 10 yards, gets away from there, looks back, okay, that wasn't anything to get scared of. And then we go back to homeostasis. Sometimes that's a problem with us, is what we'll do is your horse will want to move, right? Because they don't know how to calm themselves without fight or flight. We have to show them how to find internal safety, right? So the way they cope with it is fight or flight. If we take that away from them when they're under pressure, so oftentimes we'll clamp our legs, we pull their head back, don't go anywhere. And so that restraint just sends them way up in the sympathetic nervous system. If you think of times that you've experienced wrecks, how many times was it because of some sort of physical or psychological restraint that was getting in the way of the horse being able to reset itself? Oftentimes we'll find that's the case. Sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic. Pupils, when they're in the sympathetic nervous system, the pupils get real large. You can see the whites of their eyes. Their head comes way up above the withers. So head comes up, you know they're going into the sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate gets accelerated. Dilation of the bronchi, those are the lungs. They can expand so the horse can run and breathe. Just because they expand doesn't mean they're breathing though. Right? It prepares them for that. But they may not be taking advantage of that. They could freeze and not be breathing. So just if they're not breathing, that's not necessarily always a good sign. Relaxes the rectum. That's that poop and scoot. And they get nervous and upset where they poop and then they just take off. The hypothalamus. Here's the thalamus. It's Grand Central Station. That's everything except for smell goes to the thalamus first, and then the thalamus sends it where it needs to go. The hypothalamus is like the barometer for the autonomic nervous system. It sort of sets the temperature. So this is parasympathetic. Rest and digest. Left alone, horses would spend an awful lot of time doing this. This is really a great state for them for learning. And we want to get them in the optimum state for learning. A relaxed alertness. They're focused. Without that, we really have trouble teaching them. And I'll show you why that is, because I don't know how many emails I've dealt with from this one French woman. I won't. I don't give my horse any orders, and you and Martin are cruel and mean. You know, I let my horse do what they want to do. It's all positive. Well, that's all well and good, but if you let all the kids throw spitballs and look out the window and fall asleep with their heads on the desk, nobody's going to learn anything. So this relaxed alertness is really a good spot to be. But then they start to get a little threatened, and the head comes up above the withers. You start to see the white in the eye. We'll learn some cranial nerves. Trigeminal nerve, that means 3. It runs along the top of it's a motor sensory nerve, and it has both functions. It runs along the top of the eye, down here below, and then down the jaw. Trigeminal neuralgia is a malady that some humans get, sometimes from dental work after a while. that they irritate that trigeminal nerve, and it's like a lightning strike, really painful. Some people go through surgery just to have the nerve cut. Well, there have been studies, did I pronounce that right? Guelph, the University of Guelph, yeah. They've done some studies where they think a lot of this head tossing that you see is actually from trigeminal pain, and they can link that to careless bridling. And also yawning. I don't know if I have a picture of yawning, but apparently horses aren't yawning for the same reason. Oh, it's boring in this pasture. You know, I hung around with these dopey horses the whole time. Or it's a sunny day. It's a means of tapping into their opioid system. It's a way of dealing with stress. And oftentimes after a stressful situation, these horses will yawn and yawn and yawn and yawn, and you'll see them. They look like they're just doped out and their lip kind of droops down. And so they've done studies, well, when do they do most of this yawning? And actually around bridling. So you want to be very careful. I hate when I see somebody do this and I just hear that clank metal on teeth.